Hold it. Caleb Mercer said it quietly, but the mechanic nearest the service cart still turned. 20 yards away, Graham Whitaker's private jet sat on the rain-darkened apron outside a hangar in Savannah. The storm had passed less than an hour earlier, leaving the August air hot enough to make Caleb's Navy work shirt cling between his shoulders. 3 maintenance technicians stood near the aircraft. Another watched diagnostic readings from inside the hangar. Someone initiated the start sequence again. Caleb lowered the wrench in his hand. The turbine began to spool. Then came a faint metallic click. A pause. Another sound followed, almost buried beneath the machinery. Caleb's eyes narrowed. The engine failed to sustain the sequence. One of the technicians shook his head. Same thing. Caleb looked at the jet, then at the ground power card he was supposed to have finished 10 minutes ago. His phone vibrated against his hip. Lila. He checked the screen. Pick up at 5:30. Don't forget me again, Dad. There was a smiling face after it, but Caleb knew his 11-year-old well enough to understand the sentence mattered more than the emoji. He typed back, I won't. Then he put the phone away. If you're watching, tell me how old you are, where you're watching from, and whether you've ever noticed something everyone else seemed to miss. Caleb returned to the cart. That should have been the end of it. He was 39, a single father, and his job at the private airfield was maintaining ground equipment, not diagnosing multi-million-dollar aircraft. Years around industrial turbine systems had trained his ears to notice changes most people filtered out, but experience had also taught him something less flattering. Recognizing a familiar sound could make a man confident before it made him correct. Across the apron, Audrey Whitaker stepped from the hangar. She wore charcoal slacks, low black shoes, and a pale blue blouse with the sleeves folded once at the forearms, practical enough for the heat, without pretending she belonged on the maintenance crew. At 35, she ran flight operations for her father's company, which meant the delayed aircraft was her problem even if the broken system wasn't. A man beside her spoke urgently. Caleb couldn't hear every word, but he caught Washington, schedule, and meeting. Audrey answered without raising her voice. If maintenance doesn't release the aircraft, it stays here. The man walked away unhappy. Caleb respected the answer more than he wanted to. He checked the time. 5:08, 22 minutes. He bent over the cart again. Behind him, the technicians prepared for another controlled attempt. Caleb told himself not to listen. The starter engaged. The turbine rose. There. That same small interruption. But this time Caleb heard what came immediately before it. His hand stopped over the wrench. The technicians were watching the aircraft. Caleb was watching his phone. 5:10. If he walked away now, he could keep his promise to his daughter. If he stayed, he might involve himself in a system he was not qualified to repair because of nothing more than a sound he could not yet explain. The sequence died again. Caleb exhaled, set the wrench down, and walked toward the edge of the marked maintenance area. He did not cross it. Excuse me. One mechanic turned. Caleb pointed toward the jet. Does it always make that sound before it quits? The mechanic frowned. The turbine. Caleb shook his head. No, he looked toward the aircraft. The sound underneath it. 2 hours earlier, Caleb Mercer had been lying on hot concrete with half his body under a ground power cart when Lila called. Dad, you remember what time, right? Caleb closed his eyes. Above him, the cart's cooling fan ticked as it slowed. 5:30. And I will be there before 5:30. His 11-year-old daughter waited just long enough to make him uncomfortable. You said that Tuesday. Tuesday was different. You always say that after Tuesday becomes Tuesday. Caleb laughed despite himself. Fair point. Lila was spending the last weeks of summer at a day program near her school. Since her mother's death 4 years earlier, Caleb had built their life around schedules. School at 8. Dinner around 6:30. Laundry on Wednesday. Grocery shopping Saturday morning. Schedules made life manageable. The problem was Caleb had never met a mechanical problem that respected one. 5:30, he repeated. Okay. Love you. Love you too. He slid the phone back into his pocket and returned to work. At 39, Caleb had been maintaining ground equipment at the private airfield for nearly 3 years. Fuel carts, hydraulic service units, tow tractors, portable generators. None of it impressed people at dinner parties, which suited him fine. Before Savannah, his work had been different. Industrial turbine auxiliary systems, long shutdowns, overnight troubleshooting. Plants where a machine sitting idle for 6 hours could cost more than Caleb earned in a year. He had been good at it. Too good at staying until the problem surrendered. After Lila's mother died, that stopped feeling like something to be proud of. So Caleb chose predictable hours over better money and learned, imperfectly, to leave unfinished machines for the next shift. Across the airfield, a white private jet rolled toward the Whitaker hangar. Caleb barely looked up. By late afternoon, the storm clouds that had been building over Savannah finally opened. Rain hammered the hangar roof for 20 minutes, flooded shallow seams in the apron, then disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. The heat returned immediately. Inside the hangar, Audrey Whitaker stood beside a work table reading the aircraft status report. She was 35, with light brown hair pinned away from her face and the focused expression of someone who preferred facts delivered before excuses. Her father's name was on the company, but flight operations belonged to her. That distinction mattered to Audrey. Graham Whitaker had a Washington meeting that evening. The aircraft had already been fueled. The crew was ready. Then the jet refused to complete its startup sequence. Daniel Cross, the maintenance chief, approached with a tablet. "We're getting the same interruption. Can you clear it?" "Not responsibly yet." Audrey glanced through the hangar doors at the wet aircraft. "How long?" Daniel gave her the answer experienced people gave when they refused to manufacture certainty. "I don't know." A corporate aide standing nearby immediately stepped forward. "There's a meeting in Washington at 9. Audrey looked at him. "And there will still be a meeting at 9 if this airplane stays in Georgia. Mr. Whitaker specifically. If Daniel doesn't sign it off, nobody boards." That ended the discussion. Outside, Caleb heard the first restart attempt while replacing a worn fitting on the ground power cart. The sound carried across the wet pavement. He paused. Something in the sequence felt uneven. He listened for another second, then returned to the fitting. Not his aircraft. Not his certification. Not his problem. At 5:02, the second attempt began. This time Caleb stopped working before the turbine did. There was a small sound beneath the louder machinery. A click where his ear expected continuity. He looked toward the jet, then toward the clock above the hangar door. 28 minutes until pickup. Caleb tightened the fitting and told himself what he had spent 4 years learning to say. Leave it alone. The machine belonged to somebody else. His evening belonged to Lila. The mechanic stared at Caleb for a moment. What sound underneath it? Caleb pointed toward the jet, but stayed behind the painted boundary. Right before the sequence drops out, there's a click, then something releases earlier than I'd expect. Daniel Cross looked up from his tablet. He had heard enough airport opinions from people who knew just enough about machines to become dangerous. "You work ground equipment, right?" "Yes." "You rated on this aircraft?" "No." "Airframe and power plant license?" "No." Daniel's expression remained professional. "Then you understand why I can't troubleshoot a jet based on what somebody heard from across the apron." "I do." That answer seemed to surprise him. Caleb glanced at the time on his phone. 5:12. He should already have been walking toward his pickup. "I'm not asking you to let me touch anything," Caleb said. "And I'm not saying I know what's wrong." Daniel folded his arms. "Then what are you saying?" "That the sound doesn't match where you're looking." Daniel's face tightened slightly. "You don't know where we're looking." "Exactly." Caleb realized how that sounded and shook his head. "Sorry, that came out wrong." A woman approached from the hangar. Caleb recognized Audrey Whitaker from around the airfield, though they had never spoken. Up close, she looked less like someone waiting for a billionaire's airplane and more like someone carrying the responsibility for whether it should leave. "What came out wrong?" she asked. Daniel answered first. "Mr. Mercer thinks he heard something during the start." "Caleb," he corrected automatically. Audrey looked toward the jet. "What?" Caleb hesitated. This was the part he disliked. Hearing something unusual was easy. Explaining it without pretending to know more than he did was harder. "I heard a release or disengagement," he said. "At least that's what it sounds like from here. It happens just before the sequence quits. And you know what causes it." "No." Daniel gave Audrey a small look that said there was the problem. Caleb continued. "I used to work on industrial turbine auxiliary systems. Different equipment. Different controls. I'm not comparing them component for component." "Then what are you comparing?" Audrey asked. "Sequence." The word hung there. Caleb pointed toward Daniel's tablet. "If your data says everything is happening in the order it should, ignore me. Seriously, I need to leave anyway." His phone showed 5:14. 16 minutes. Audrey noticed him checking it. "You have somewhere to be?" "My daughter." That was enough explanation for Caleb. Daniel looked back at the aircraft. We already have fault indications. I believe you. And you still think we're looking in the wrong place. Caleb considered the question. No. I think there's a sound I don't understand. That changed something. Not much. But Audrey stopped looking at him like another person offering a theory and started listening. Caleb nodded toward the aircraft. On the next attempt, tell me what should be happening when that sound occurs. If what I'm hearing belongs there, I walk away and you lose 30 seconds. Daniel glanced at Audrey. Audrey did not tell him to trust Caleb. She asked a better question. Can he observe without interfering with your procedure? Daniel looked toward the marked safety area. From outside. The line. Then he stays outside the line. Caleb checked his phone again. 5:15. He had spent 4 years trying to become the kind of father who knew when to leave work unfinished. Now he had 15 minutes to prove he had actually learned it. Daniel signaled to the crew. Controlled start attempt. Caleb moved to the designated observation point. He put his hands in his pockets. No tools. No touching. Just listening. The starter engaged. The sound rose across the wet pavement. Caleb closed his eyes. This time, he wasn't listening for what failed. He was listening for what happened too soon. The starter climbed into a steady whine. Caleb kept his eyes closed. Not because closing them made his hearing better. It simply removed the movement around him. The technicians watching gauges. Daniel holding the tablet. Audrey standing near the hangar entrance. The turbine rose. A faint mechanical click. Caleb opened his eyes. There. Daniel looked at the data. Nothing abnormal yet. Wait. Less than a second later came the sound Caleb had been chasing. A brief metallic release, almost swallowed by the turbine. Then the sequence weakened. The system shut itself down. Daniel checked the tablet. Same fault. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He replayed the sounds in his head. The second noise reminded him of an actuator releasing under command. Years earlier, on industrial auxiliary units, he had heard similar sequences when a control system stopped holding something engaged. Similar did not mean identical. He knew that. Still, the timing bothered him. What should stay engaged between that first click and shutdown? Caleb asked. Daniel studied him. Several things. Anything commanded to release? Not at that point. Caleb looked toward the aircraft. That's what sounds wrong. Daniel stepped closer. You're hearing a component disengage? I think I am. You think? Yes. Caleb deliberately left the word standing. Audrey came over. What would make something disengage early? Caleb shook his head. That's where I stopped being useful. I don't know this aircraft. Daniel glanced down at the recorded sequence. But if he's hearing what he thinks he's hearing, we may be treating the shutdown as the failure when something is dropping out before it. For the first time, Daniel sounded curious rather than skeptical. Audrey caught it. Can you check? Daniel nodded slowly, without taking his guess as a diagnosis. That's exactly what I want. Caleb's phone buzzed. 5:19, a message from Lila. Leaving yet? His stomach tightened. He typed with both thumbs. Got held up. Calling Mrs. Bennett. Their neighbor, Marjorie Bennett, had been on the approved pickup list since Lila was 8. Caleb hated using that backup for a problem that wasn't even his responsibility. He called anyway. Marjorie answered on the second ring. Airport. How did you know? Because you never call me at 5:19 to discuss gardening. Caleb looked down. Can you get Lila? Already putting my shoes on. I owe you. You owe your daughter an explanation. That too. When the call ended, Caleb found Audrey watching him. You could leave, she said. I know. Why aren't you? Caleb looked toward the jet. Because now I want to know whether I heard it correctly. He regretted the sentence almost immediately. There it was, the old part of him. The part that could turn a machine into a challenge and a challenge into permission to forget the clock. He slipped his phone back into his pocket. Give me 10 more minutes, he said, though he wasn't sure whether he was speaking to Audrey or himself. Daniel returned with 2 technicians and the relevant maintenance information. They did not hand Caleb the documents. Daniel summarized what could be shared and walked through the expected start sequence. Caleb listened. One stage caught his attention. Go back. Daniel repeated it. Caleb pointed toward the jet. That event. If it happened early, would it sound like what we just heard? Possibly. And would the system still attempt to continue? For a moment, Caleb felt the pieces begin to align. Not proof. A shape. Daniel ordered an approved check focused on that portion of the sequence. Audrey moved to a nearby workstation and pulled up the aircraft's recent discrepancy history. Most entries were routine. Then she stopped scrolling. Daniel. He walked over. 3 weeks ago. Crew note. Daniel read it. Brief hesitation during startup. No repeat on second attempt. Audrey looked at Caleb. Does that matter? Maybe. Caleb stepped closer to the workstation without touching it. When? What do you mean? When in the sequence did they notice the hesitation? The note didn't say. Daniel pulled up additional records. Caleb waited. The heat pressed against the open hangar. Somewhere beyond the fence, tires hissed across a wet access road. Finally, Daniel found a time-stamped entry. He looked at Caleb. The hesitation had occurred in almost the same part of the sequence. Daniel's skepticism didn't disappear. It changed shape. We can test your theory. Caleb shook his head. Not my theory yet. What would you call it? A reason to look. The technicians began preparing the check. For the first time that afternoon, Caleb felt the dangerous satisfaction of a pattern starting to make sense. He knew that feeling. It had made him right many times. It had also made him wrong with remarkable confidence. But when Daniel's initial test produced a reading that appeared to support the early disengagement idea, even Caleb felt his caution loosen. Audrey noticed. So you found it? Caleb watched the technicians reposition their equipment. No, a beat passed. Then he added, quieter than before. But I think we're close. Daniel Cross did not rush the next test. That alone made Caleb trust him more. The maintenance team worked through the approved procedure while Caleb remained outside the marked area, watching without pretending that watching made him part of the crew. Audrey stood near the workstation with the discrepancy history still open. The reading they had found looked promising. Too promising. Caleb knew that feeling too. Daniel finally looked up. We've isolated the component you were hearing. Caleb stepped closer to the boundary. And it's responding. Caleb waited. Daniel turned the tablet so one of his technicians could see it. Within limits. The satisfaction Caleb had felt 5 minutes earlier disappeared. Then I was wrong. Maybe not about the sound. About what it meant. Daniel gave a small nod. There was no pleasure in it. No victory. Just information. Audrey folded her arms. What happens next? We finish the check, Daniel said. Then we know whether we've ruled it out. They did. The component Caleb had suspected was not failing. A few minutes later, the team prepared another controlled start attempt. Caleb checked his phone. 5:31. A message from Marjorie waited for him. Got her. She's complaining about my music, so she's fine. Below it was another message. From Lila. You owe me fries. Caleb almost smiled. Then the starter engaged. Everyone turned toward the jet. The sequence built. The first click came. Then the second. For half a second, Caleb expected the sound to continue differently, because now they had looked where he told them to look. It didn't. The turbine began to fall away. The system shut down again. Daniel lowered the tablet. One technician exhaled through his nose. Another stared at the aircraft. Caleb said nothing. The silence bothered him more than the failure. Daniel studied the new diagnostic data. That's different. Audrey moved beside him. Different how? We triggered a protection response during the sequence. Because of the test? I don't know yet. Caleb looked toward the jet. What kind of protection response? Daniel's eyes stayed on the tablet. One that tells the system not to continue. Caleb felt the shape of his original theory collapse. He had heard something release early and assumed the release was the problem. But what if it had been told to release? That was different. Very different. Still, he had already taken enough of their time. I should go. Audrey looked at him. Because you were wrong? Because I said 10 minutes 20 minutes ago. That isn't what I asked. Caleb rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. His shirt was damp from the heat. The air smelled like wet concrete and jet fuel. I recognized a pattern, he said. Then I got attached to it. Daniel looked over. That happens. Not if you're smart. Daniel gave him a tired half-smile. Especially if you're smart. Caleb appreciated the kindness, but didn't accept the excuse. He had spent years trusting his ear around machines. Somewhere between the second test and Daniel finding that matching reading, Caleb had stopped asking whether his idea was right and started expecting the aircraft to prove it. That was exactly the habit he had once promised himself he would leave behind. His phone buzzed again. Lila this time. Mrs. Bennett says you're fixing a Billionaire's airplane. Caleb typed, I'm not fixing anything. 3 dots appeared. Then why are you still there? He stared at the question. He had no answer he liked. Caleb put the phone away. I've probably added more noise than help, he said. You know the sound is there. You don't need me guessing at it. He started toward his cart. Caleb. Audrey's voice stopped him. He turned. She was still beside Daniel's workstation. You thought the second sound was happening too early. Yes. And you were wrong about what produced it. Yes. Audrey glanced toward the aircraft. Were you wrong about when it happened? Caleb opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He replayed the sequence. First click. Brief interval. Release. Shutdown. Again. First click. Brief interval. Release. Protection. His eyes moved back to the jet. No, Daniel straightened slightly. Caleb walked back, but stopped at the same painted line. The timing is still wrong. Audrey nodded once. Then maybe we're asking the wrong question. Caleb looked at Daniel's tablet. Until that moment, everyone, including Caleb, had been trying to identify what made the sound. He suddenly cared less about that. What happens immediately before it, he asked. Daniel looked down at the sequence data. Caleb continued. Not what fails after it. Not what makes the noise. He pointed toward the aircraft. What does the airplane think is happening right before that sound? For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Daniel began scrolling backward through the data instead of forward. And Caleb understood that hearing the wrong sound had never been the important part. The important part was figuring out why the machine believed it was making the right one. Daniel scrolled backward through the start sequence, one event at a time. Caleb watched from the other side of the painted line. Stop looking for the noise, he said. Daniel glanced up. Caleb heard how that sounded. I mean, we already know when we hear it. What I want to know is what the system believes happened before it. Audrey moved closer to the workstation. Daniel pulled up a more detailed event log. You're assuming the release is commanded. No. I assumed the opposite 20 minutes ago, and that didn't go very well. Daniel almost smiled. So now I'm trying not to assume anything. That was harder than Caleb made it sound. Machines had always made sense to him because they followed causes. Pressure changed. Voltage dropped. A valve moved. Something happened because something else happened first. People were Messier. So were computerized systems when the information they received was wrong. Daniel began walking through the sequence aloud. Audrey opened the earlier crew reports on a second screen. Caleb listened. He no longer tried to match aircraft components to equipment he had worked on years ago. That comparison had already pulled him toward the wrong answer once. Instead, he wrote 4 times on the back of an unused maintenance supply receipt Daniel handed him. Start command. First click. Second sound. Shutdown. That's your technical diagram? Audrey asked. It's what I'm qualified to draw. This time Daniel did smile. They compared the recorded sequence with Caleb's rough timing. The second sound came after a change in system state, but before the shutdown indication everyone had been treating as the central event. Daniel tapped the screen. If this input changes, protection logic can interrupt the sequence. Can? Caleb asked. Under the right conditions. What conditions? Daniel explained them. Caleb understood about half of the aircraft-specific details and did not pretend otherwise. Audrey noticed. You lost him. About 3 acronyms ago, Caleb said. Daniel translated it into plain English. Caleb looked back at the aircraft. So the system could be doing exactly what it's supposed to do, if it believes the input. And if the input is wrong, Daniel's expression changed. Then we have a different problem. Audrey searched the maintenance history again. Not for failures this time. 4. Interruptions. Hesitations. Anything that had been dismissed because the next start worked normally. Caleb's phone rang. He knew the ringtone. Lila. He stepped away before answering. Hey. You said Mrs. Bennett was just getting me. I know. It's almost 6. Caleb looked at the clock above the hangar. 5:54. He had stopped checking. That bothered him. Yeah. Are you coming home? He looked toward Daniel and Audrey. They were still working through the records. For years, Caleb had believed being a good father meant having an answer ready. After his wife died, he had become especially good at promises. Dinner will be ready. I'll make the meeting. I'll be there at 5:30. Sometimes the promise mattered more to him than whether reality could support it. I'm going to be late, he said. Lila was quiet. Caleb continued before he could soften it into something less honest. I should have told you sooner. I got caught up in something. The airplane. Yeah. Are you fixing it? No, that answer came easier now. I'm helping people figure out what question to ask. That sounds like fixing it with extra steps. Caleb laughed. Mrs. Bennett feeding you? She made meatloaf. You hate her meatloaf. I'm being brave. I'll bring fries. You already owe me fries. Then I'll bring better fries. When the call ended, Caleb stood for a moment with the phone still in his hand. He had missed pickup. He could not undo that by pretending the work had been more important. But he could stop turning mistakes into excuses. He returned to the workstation. Audrey had found something. Look at these dates. Daniel leaned in. 3 earlier startup hesitation reports. Weeks apart. No confirmed fault. Each event had cleared on a later attempt. What was the weather? Caleb asked. Audrey looked at him. Why? I don't know yet. She pulled up the operational notes associated with the flights. One departure followed heavy rain. Another had been after the aircraft sat outside overnight in coastal humidity. The third was less clear. Daniel shook his head. That's not enough to connect them. I agree, Caleb said. Audrey looked surprised. Caleb pointed at the screen. It's enough not to throw them away. Daniel ordered a non-invasive check allowed under the maintenance procedure. The team repositioned. Another controlled sequence began. Caleb stood farther back this time. He listened. First click, then the interval, then the sound. But now, because he was no longer asking what component made it, he heard it differently. Not like something breaking, like something obeying. The sequence stopped. Daniel studied the new data. Audrey looked toward Caleb. Well, Caleb didn't answer. He stared at the 4 lines he had written on the receipt. Then he crossed out the word second sound. Beside them, he wrote, response. Daniel came over. What are you thinking? That I've been treating the sound like the problem. And now, Caleb folded the receipt once. I think it may be proof that something else is working. Audrey looked toward the silent jet. So we spent all afternoon listening to the wrong thing? Caleb shook his head. No. He looked at the event log again. We were listening to the right thing. A pause. We just kept asking it the wrong question. Audrey went back through the 3 earlier hesitation reports. This time she ignored the technician's conclusions and looked at what had happened around each event. 2 were after heavy moisture exposure, she said. The 3rd aircraft log doesn't mention weather. Daniel checked another record. It was parked outside overnight. In Savannah? Caleb asked. Daniel nodded. Caleb looked through the open hangar doors. The last storm clouds were breaking apart beyond the runway, and the wet apron reflected strips of orange evening light. Still not proof. No, Audrey said. But now it's a pattern. Daniel brought up the latest start data. Caleb listened as he explained what the aircraft had reported immediately before the protection logic interrupted the sequence. Caleb didn't understand every parameter. He didn't need to. What I need, he said, is the order. Daniel pointed through the events. This changes here. The system evaluates it here. Then protection logic responds. And the sound. After that, Caleb stared at the screen. That was it. Not the sound itself. The distance between events. Can we compare the timing from the previous attempts? Daniel pulled them up. Caleb took out the folded receipt again. He marked the intervals while Daniel read them aloud. The numbers varied slightly, but not randomly. Every failed attempt compressed the same part of the sequence. Caleb looked up. That's what I heard. Audrey frowned. The click? No, I thought it was the click. He pointed at the marks. It's the gap. Daniel leaned closer. Caleb continued. The sound only got my attention because it arrived before my ear expected it. I kept trying to identify the noise. But the noise isn't unusual by itself. Daniel looked back at the event log. The system is being told to respond early. Or it thinks it is. Audrey turned toward Daniel. What could make it think that? Daniel named several possibilities, then stopped himself. Instead of guessing, he opened the applicable troubleshooting information. Caleb stepped back. This was Daniel's territory now. A technician performed the next approved check. Another monitored the relevant data while Audrey compared the results against the earlier discrepancies. One possible cause disappeared. Then another. The third did not. Daniel studied the result twice. We have an unstable input. Audrey looked at him. Enough to trigger the protection logic? Under these conditions, yes. Caleb felt no rush of victory. Mostly relief that they finally had something measurable. Audrey glanced toward the damp apron. And moisture? Could explain why it was intermittent, Daniel said. But we verify. We don't build the conclusion backward. Caleb smiled faintly. That sounds familiar. Daniel gave him a look. You've been here long enough to become annoying. Occupational hazard. For the first time all evening, Audrey laughed. Then her phone rang. She read the screen, and the smile disappeared. My father. She answered. Caleb could hear only her side. No, we are not released. A pause. I understand the meeting. Another pause. No. Starting is not the same as being safe to dispatch. Daniel looked at Caleb. Audrey listened for several seconds. Then she said, calmly, I'll call when maintenance signs the aircraft off. She ended the call. Nobody commented. Daniel returned to the procedure. Caleb looked at the jet. The problem was no longer a mysterious sound. It was a chain, a questionable input, a correct protective response, a shutdown everyone had mistaken for the failure itself. And now, for the first time, each person standing there held a different piece of the same answer. Caleb could hear the pattern. Daniel could prove it. Audrey could give them the time to do it properly. None of them could finish without the other two. Daniel would not call it a fix. Not yet. The unstable input gave the maintenance team a direction, but direction was not clearance. Daniel and his technicians worked through the approved troubleshooting procedure while Caleb stayed where he had been all evening. Outside the boundary, close enough to observe and far enough away that nobody could confuse his involvement with authorization. Audrey stood beside the workstation. What do we know? She asked. Daniel answered carefully. We know the protection logic is responding correctly to the information it receives. We know one input becomes unstable during the start sequence. We know the instability lines up with the timing Caleb noticed. And the moisture? Possible contributor, not confirmed cause. Caleb nodded. Earlier, he would have wanted the sentence completed. Now he preferred it unfinished. One technician called Daniel over. They reviewed a test result, then repeated the check. The second result matched the first. Daniel looked toward Caleb. You were right about the timing. Caleb shook his head. I was wrong about the diagnosis. Both can be true. That landed harder than Caleb expected. For years, he had treated being wrong as something that erased whatever came before it. A wrong answer meant the whole line of thought had failed. Tonight, being wrong had forced them to ask a better question. Daniel's team isolated the source of the unstable signal through the aircraft's approved procedure. The technicians inspected the affected area, verified the condition, and performed the required corrective work. Caleb watched. He never asked to help. When the work was finished, Daniel reviewed every step before authorizing another controlled start. Audrey's phone buzzed twice on the workstation. She ignored it. Daniel noticed. You can tell them we're close. I can tell them we're testing. He nodded. That's the better answer. The technicians cleared the area. Caleb moved back to the observation point. The evening had cooled slightly, though the humidity still hung over the apron. Lights along the hangar had come on, throwing pale reflections across the wet concrete. Daniel raised a hand. Start attempt. Caleb found himself closing his eyes again. The starter engaged. The familiar whine rose. First event. Caleb waited. His mind wanted to pull the second sound forward. It didn't come. Not yet. The interval stretched to where his ear had expected it all along. Then, click. Caleb opened his eyes. The sequence continued. No premature release. No sudden collapse. The turbine climbed and stabilized. One technician looked at Daniel. Another gave a small thumbs up before catching himself and returning to the instruments. Audrey let out a breath. It started. Daniel did not celebrate. It completed a start. Audrey looked at him. Difference. A very expensive difference. Caleb smiled. Daniel's team continued monitoring. Nobody boarded. Nobody opened champagne. Nobody called Washington to announce that the problem was over. The aircraft had started, but Audrey had spent the entire evening refusing to confuse progress with permission. Her phone rang again. This time she answered. Yes, it started. She listened. No, that does not mean we're leaving. Another pause. Because Daniel hasn't released it. Her expression tightened slightly. Then she looked through the hangar doors at the aircraft. I'm responsible for this flight. We wait. She ended the call. Caleb glanced at Daniel. Your turn. Daniel nodded. The maintenance team completed the required checks, reviewed the recorded data, and confirmed that the start sequence now behaved as expected. Only then did Daniel make the entry that mattered. Aircraft released. Audrey read it before making her call. Caleb picked up the folded receipt from the workstation. For handwritten. Lines covered one side. One was crossed out. Beside it was a single word. Response. He folded it again and put it in his pocket. Daniel noticed. Keeping the evidence. Keeping the mistake. Daniel gave him a questioning look. Caleb nodded toward the jet. I heard the wrong sound and decided I knew what it meant. You also stayed long enough to correct yourself. That part took longer. Audrey joined them. For what it's worth, if you hadn't said something, We would have kept working the original fault path. Caleb looked at Daniel. And if he hadn't challenged me, I would have sent you down the wrong one. Daniel nodded toward Audrey. And if she'd pushed us to make the schedule, none of that would matter. For a moment, the three of them stood without speaking. No hero, no defeated expert, no single person holding the answer. Just three people who had each been missing something the others could provide. Caleb's phone vibrated. A text from Lila. Fries are getting cold, old man. He smiled. I really have to go. Audrey glanced toward the jet. You don't want to see it take off? Caleb looked once at the aircraft, then toward the employee parking lot. No, he pulled out his keys. I already heard what I needed to hear. Caleb found Lila at Mrs. Bennett's kitchen table with a paper bag of fries open between them. She looked at the clock on the wall before she looked at him. 6:47. I know. You said 5:30. I know that too. Mrs. Bennett stood at the counter, pretending not to listen. Caleb put his keys down. I'm sorry. Lila studied him. She had expected an explanation. Maybe an excuse. Caleb gave her neither. I told you I'd be there, and I wasn't. I should have called sooner instead of making you ask where I was. Lila pushed the bag toward him. One fry. That's all I get. You're lucky you got one. He took it. Fair. 10 minutes later, they were in Caleb's pickup heading home. The roads were still wet from the storm. Warm night air came through the windows, carrying the smell of rain, pavement, and cut grass from somewhere beyond the airport fence. Lila turned down the radio. So did you fix the Billionaire's jet? No, you were. There for almost 2 hours. Still no. Then who fixed it? The maintenance team. She looked disappointed. Caleb smiled. I heard something strange. I thought I knew what it meant. And you did. Nope. That got her attention. You were wrong. Very. Lila grinned. Can I get that in writing? Caleb reached into his pocket and handed her the folded receipt. Already did. She opened it under the dashboard light. What's response? The sound I thought was the problem. Turns out it was something responding to another problem. So you heard the wrong sound. Kind of. And that helped. Eventually, she folded the paper again. Caleb slowed at a red light. I think we were listening for an answer before we understood the question. Lila considered that with the seriousness children sometimes gave ideas adults expected them to ignore. Then she handed the receipt back. Sounds inefficient. Caleb laughed. Extremely. Across town, the Whitaker aircraft remained on the ground until Daniel's final checks were complete. Audrey did not shorten the process because her father was wealthy, and Daniel did not change the standard because the passenger had influence. When the jet finally departed, there was no ceremony. That was probably appropriate. Caleb never needed Graham Whitaker to shake his hand for the evening to matter. He did not need money, a promotion, or an impressive new title. Daniel's qualifications had mattered. Audrey's authority had mattered. Caleb's ear had mattered. So had Caleb admitting he was wrong. People often make the mistake of attaching human worth to the things that are easiest to see. A tailored suit, an expensive aircraft, a job title, a paycheck, or the kind of car someone drives home in. But wealth does not make a person more deserving of dignity, and having less does not make someone smaller. A billionaire deserves to be treated as a human being rather than a bank account. A mechanic, a cleaner, a driver, or a single father deserves the same basic respect rather than being measured by what he owns. Respect should not begin when we discover that someone is secretly important. People are already important. That evening worked. Because nobody had to be humiliated for somebody else to matter. Daniel could challenge Caleb without treating him as stupid. Caleb could be wrong without becoming worthless. Audrey could have power without using it to make other people feel small. Sometimes respect looks less dramatic than applause. It looks like listening. It looks like saying, I don't know. It looks like allowing another person to finish a thought before deciding what their clothes, income, education, or position supposedly says about them. The pickup rolled onto Caleb's street. Lila suddenly leaned toward the dashboard. Dad, what? Listen. A soft rattle came from somewhere near the passenger side. Caleb tilted his head. Lila's eyes widened. Is that sound supposed to be there? Caleb listened through one stop sign. Then another. Finally, he smiled. That one is. You sure? Caleb glanced at her. After the evening he had just had, there was only one reasonable answer. Pretty sure. Lila laughed. Caleb did too. And the old pickup carried them home, making exactly the sounds it was supposed to make.